Dr. Charles Beaumont liked to think of himself as a man who had risen above circumstance. He came from a modest family, his father a teacher and his mother a homemaker. But it was his mother who had shaped him. Watching her suffer from a rare condition, a frailty of the body that medical science struggled to understand, had been the defining experience of his young life. She had Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, a rare connective tissue disorder that left her skin fragile and her joints weak. Dr. Beaumont had spent his childhood in hospital corridors, watching doctors fail to cure the woman he loved most. Before we dive deeper, let me know where you're watching from, and trust me, you'll want to stick around until the end. The twist in this story will leave you speechless. His mother had died when he was only 19, just as he was starting college. It was the helplessness of those years, the feeling of watching someone you love crumble while you can do nothing, that had driven him to become a doctor. Not just any doctor, but one of the best in the country. He dedicated his life to medicine, fueled by the burning desire to be the doctor his mother never had. By the time he reached 48, Dr. Beaumont had achieved more than he ever imagined. His private practice, located in one of the most exclusive areas of the city, was renowned for serving the ultra-wealthy. Politicians, CEOs, celebrities, they all came to him, trusting him not only with their health but with their privacy. His wealth had grown as his reputation soared, and so had his detachment from the world outside his high-rise office. His clinic was a pristine, well-oiled machine. Patients were scheduled weeks in advance, every detail meticulously planned. Dr. Beaumont valued order, control, and precision. There was no room for uncertainty, no space for the kind of chaos that had defined his mother's life. To him, success meant eliminating vulnerability and ensuring that nothing was left to chance. That's why when Linda, his assistant, knocked on his door that morning with news of a walk-in, it immediately irritated him. "A walk-in?" Dr. Beaumont asked, frowning. His day was planned to the minute. A walk-in meant disruption. "Do they have an appointment?" "No, doctor," Linda replied, her voice hesitant. "But she said it's urgent." Dr. Beaumont sighed, glancing at the clock. Every slot today was filled with clients who paid handsomely for his time. He prided himself on running a tight schedule, and this walk-in was already throwing off his carefully planned day. "Do they have insurance?" he asked, his voice clipped. "No," Linda said, "but she's been to 3 clinics already. She's desperate." Dr. Beaumont stared at Linda for a moment, debating whether to dismiss the patient outright. He had no obligation to see anyone without an appointment or insurance, and his time was too valuable to waste on charity cases. Still, something in Linda's tone made him curious. He sighed again and waved his hand, motioning for her to send the patient in. The woman who entered his office was not the type of person Dr. Beaumont was used to treating. She was black, in her mid-30s, dressed in worn clothes that looked like they'd seen too many years of hardship. She looked tired, beyond tired, exhausted in a way that spoke of more than just physical fatigue. Her eyes carried the weight of someone who had been fighting battles no one could see. "I'm sorry for coming in like this," the woman began, her voice steady but with a desperation she was trying to conceal. "I've been to 3 clinics already. They said you might be able to help." Dr. Beaumont gave her a quick once-over. She clearly didn't belong here, not in his world of high-paying clients and top-tier service. There was no way she could afford his fees, and he wasn't in the business of treating people out of the goodness of his heart. "You don't have insurance?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "No," the woman said quietly, "but I'm really sick. I need help." He nodded, but it was more out of habit than genuine concern. "This is a private clinic. Without insurance, I'm afraid I can't help you." The woman blinked, and for a moment, Dr. Beaumont thought she might argue or plead, but instead, she just nodded slowly, as though she'd expected this. "I understand," she whispered. "Thank you for your time." She turned to leave. Her shoulders slumped, and Dr. Beaumont turned back to his computer, already pushing her out of his mind. He had patients to see, clients who could pay for his expertise. Whatever her problem was, it wasn't his responsibility. But as the door clicked shut behind her, a strange feeling lingered. For just a second, he had seen something in her eyes, a flash of hopelessness, a look he had seen in his mother's eyes during those final years. He shook it off. His mother had been different. This woman, Sarah, he recalled from the intake form, was just one of many people who slipped through the cracks. It wasn't his job to save her. Later that afternoon, Dr. Beaumont was finishing up with his last patient of the day when Linda knocked on his door again. "Doctor," she said, stepping into the room, "that woman from earlier, Sarah Washington, she left these behind." She handed him a folder, her medical records. Dr. Beaumont took the folder absent-mindedly, barely glancing at it before placing it on his desk. He didn't have time to deal with this. But as Linda left, something gnawed at him. He opened the folder and scanned the contents, his eyes landing on a diagnosis that made his heart skip a beat. Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, his mother's condition. He stared at the words on the page, his mind suddenly spinning. The symptoms, fragile skin, joint pain, hypermobility, they all matched. It was rare, incredibly rare, and it was hereditary. He knew that all too well. For a moment he sat in stunned silence, his mind racing back to his mother, to the hospitals, the surgeries that had done little to ease her suffering. He had vowed never to feel that kind of helplessness again, but now, here was this woman, this stranger, suffering from the same thing. Suddenly, the memory of her face, the weariness in her eyes came rushing back. Could it be a coincidence? It had to be. There was no way this woman was connected to him in any meaningful way. But the feeling in his gut told him otherwise. He couldn't shake the sense that he had overlooked something important. Without thinking, he picked up the phone and called Linda back into the room. The next morning, Dr. Beaumont arrived at the clinic earlier than usual, his mind still tangled in the thoughts of the previous day. He called Linda into his office as soon as she arrived. "Linda, do we have any contact information for that woman, Sarah Washington?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Linda frowned, clearly puzzled by his sudden interest. "She didn't leave much, doctor. Just her medical records. Why?" Dr. Beaumont hesitated. Why indeed? He had no logical reason to pursue this, no professional obligation to get involved, but something about that diagnosis, the name, the woman herself, it gnawed at him in a way he couldn't explain. "Check again," he said, more firmly this time. "There has to be something." Linda nodded and left the room, leaving Dr. Beaumont alone with his thoughts. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the empty space where Sarah had stood the day before. What was it about her that made him feel like he had missed something crucial? The records, the condition. Everything felt too close, too familiar. After an hour, Linda returned, holding a small slip of paper. "She left an address on one of her old medical forms," Linda said, handing him the paper. "It's not complete, but it might be enough to find her." Dr. Beaumont stared at the address for a moment, then stood up, grabbing his coat and keys. He wasn't sure what he would find, but he had to know. The address led Dr. Beaumont to a part of the city he hadn't been to in years. The buildings were older here, worn down by time and neglect. As he parked his car and stepped out onto the sidewalk, he felt a strange sense of displacement. This world, the world Sarah lived in, was so far removed from his own, a world where people fought for survival rather than success. He found the apartment building easily enough. It was run down, the paint peeling from the walls, and the stairs creaked underfoot as he climbed to the third floor. His footsteps echoed in the narrow hallway as he approached the door that matched the address on the paper. He knocked, the sound loud and jarring in the quiet building. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and Sarah stood there, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw him. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. "I came to talk, doctor," Beaumont said, trying to steady his voice. He hadn't planned what to say, but he knew he couldn't leave without speaking to her. "I saw your medical records after you left. There's something you need to know." Sarah's expression shifted, her eyes narrowing. "You turned me away," she said bluntly. "Why should I listen to you now?" Dr. Beaumont felt a pang of guilt. He had turned her away without a second thought, dismissing her because she didn't fit into his world. But now he was starting to realize that there was more to her story, more to her. "I made a mistake," he admitted, his voice softening. "But please, hear me out." For a moment Sarah hesitated. She studied him, as if trying to decide whether he was worth listening to. Finally, with a resigned sigh, she stepped aside and let him in. Inside, the apartment was small and modest, the furniture mismatched and worn. There was a smell of old wood and cooking in the air, a faint warmth that made Dr. Beaumont feel strangely out of place. He stood awkwardly in the middle of the room as Sarah crossed her arms, watching him. "I don't understand," she said, her voice edged with impatience. "What do you want to tell me?" Dr. Beaumont took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around the folder in his hand. "Your condition," he began slowly. "It's hereditary." "I know that," Sarah said, frowning. "It's been in my family." "It's in mine too," Dr. Beaumont said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My mother had Ehlers-Danlos syndrome." Sarah blinked, confusion flashing across her face. "What does that have to do with me?" Dr. Beaumont hesitated. How could he explain the storm of thoughts swirling in his head, the strange connection he was beginning to suspect? "I had a relationship," he said slowly, "years ago, before I became a doctor, with a woman named Evelyn Washington." At the mention of her mother's name, Sarah's face went pale. "That's my mother," she whispered. Dr. Beaumont felt the world tilt on its axis. He knew it, but hearing her say it made everything real. "I think I'm your father." The silence that followed his words was so heavy it seemed to crush the air out of the room. Sarah stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. "What?" she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "I think I'm your father," Dr. Beaumont repeated, the words sounding surreal even as he said them. He had never imagined himself in this position, never thought he would have to confront something like this. Sarah took a step back, her hand gripping the back of a chair, as if she needed something to steady her. "You think you're my father?" Her voice rose with disbelief, then anger. "You—" She laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "You think you can just show up here after all these years and say that?" Dr. Beaumont flinched at the anger in her voice. But he couldn't blame her. He had walked out of her mother's life all those years ago, never imagining the consequences. He had left Evelyn without a second thought, without even knowing she was pregnant. And now, here he was, standing before the daughter he had never known, the daughter he had failed. "I didn't know," he said quietly, his voice filled with regret. "I didn't know about you." "You didn't care enough to find out," Sarah shot back, her voice shaking. "My mother raised me alone, struggling to make ends meet. And you were off living your life, weren't you? Living your perfect, successful life while we were left behind." Dr. Beaumont felt each word like a dagger to the heart. He had never thought about what his absence might have meant for Evelyn, for the child she had raised alone. He had been too focused on his own success, on building his career and his life. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't know." "Sorry?" Sarah laughed again, the sound filled with years of pain and bitterness. "You think sorry is enough? My mother is dead. She's gone and you—" She stopped, her voice cracking with emotion. "You weren't there." Dr. Beaumont lowered his head, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him like a mountain. "I know I can't change the past," he said softly, "but I want to try. I want to make things right, if you'll let me." Sarah shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know if that's possible." Over the next few weeks, Dr. Beaumont returned to Sarah's apartment, determined to build some kind of relationship with her. It wasn't easy. Sarah had spent her entire life resenting the man who had abandoned her, and she wasn't quick to forgive. But little by little, they began to talk. Dr. Beaumont learned about the life Sarah had lived, how hard it had been growing up without a father, how her mother had sacrificed everything to provide for her. Sarah, in turn, began to see past the cold, wealthy exterior of the man she had hated for so long. One afternoon, as they sat together in a park near her apartment, Sarah opened up about her dreams. "I always wanted to be a nurse," she admitted. "But I couldn't afford to go to school. And then Mom got sick." "You can still go to school," Dr. Beaumont said, feeling a surge of pride. "It's not too late." Sarah glanced at him, her eyes wary. "I told you, I don't want your money." "It's not about money," he said gently. "It's about helping you achieve your dreams. I want to be there for you, Sarah, not as a doctor, but as your father." For a long moment Sarah said nothing, her eyes locked on his. Then, slowly, she nodded. "One step at a time," she said softly. Months passed, and slowly, cautiously, Dr. Beaumont and Sarah began to build a relationship. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, still wounds that hadn't fully healed, but they kept moving forward, together. Dr. Beaumont helped Sarah enroll in nursing school, but more than that, he was there for her in ways he had never been before. He listened, he supported, and he learned what it meant to be a father. One evening, as Dr. Beaumont stood by the window of his office, looking out over the city skyline, he thought about how much had changed. He had spent his life chasing success and wealth, but now he understood that those things didn't matter. What mattered was the people you loved, the relationships you nurtured, and the family you chose to fight for. And for the first time in his life, Dr. Beaumont felt truly at peace. Neither he nor Sarah was alone anymore.